So we come to the conclusion of our program today. One of the main activities and events of today is the Connelly Lecture for Pathology Informatics. So many of you have heard me before talk about our institution and how the University of Minnesota is known as the land of giants. Many giants of pathology that you see across the country in many fields went through the University of Minnesota. We heard today about how Dr. Nakla himself trained in the University of Minnesota. We see many giants in pathology are in the room today, and we see many future giants are being groomed in the back. And I have always been very interested in studying giants and how they influence humanity and how they influence people around them. And the impact of giants and the real giants, their legacy and their influence does not end by their passing. Their influence continues for generations and generations. So today, for example, we are talking about frozen section, and we learned this morning the story of how Dr. Wilson went through this institution back in 1902, and he went to Mayo Clinic, and he was the very first pathologist to do a frozen section. So today, everything we do and we take for granted, probably we need to think of Dr. Wilson and how he invented frozen sections. So people like us today, we come, a person like me, I come today and I do great things in frozen sections. As a matter of fact, I see way further than the giant himself could see. How do I do that? By standing on the shoulder of the giant. And this is how giants influence the world around them. They just allow people to stand on their shoulders to see well beyond even where they could see when they started. And one of the famous stories that highlights this phenomenon is the story of informatics in the University of Minnesota. And if you haven't read this book, I really urge you to acquire it or read it. We have many copies in our department. Certainly my office has few copies. You are welcome to come and borrow it, because it shows how one giant was able to lead our institution through the journey over 50 years, over the journey of informatics, and make us the leaders we are today. And that leader was none other than Dr. Donald Connelly. Dr. Connelly was a husband, was a parent, was a grandparent, was an educator, was a researcher, was a great teacher, but also was a visionary. Back in the 1970s, he could see what others couldn't. Others didn't even know about computers, but he was able to see the future of informatics with the University of Minnesota. Dr. Connelly passed away last month, but we are very honored and very fortunate today to have Rosella, his wife, and two of his grandchildren with us. Could you please stand, Rosella, so people can, please. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you did. Thank you for supporting Dr. Connelly, and thank you for bringing us and being with us today and bringing us to where we are today. Some few of the highlights of Dr. Connelly's career. He was a professor of pathology in our department, the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology with the University of Minnesota. He was the director of Health Informatics Division. Dr. Connelly held many administrative and teaching positions in our institution. He led the whole organization into informatics. He developed the very first successful University of Minnesota laboratory information system. Yes, it was clinical pathology, but it was the very first web-based information system for the university. That was only possible through the effort and the work of the dedicated faculty and staff who back at the time supported him. They worked even on their own computers, and they did that willingly to support our university. Dr. Connelly was a fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics, a founding member of the American Medical Informatics Association, and was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association of Pathology Informatics in 2003. He was a researcher. He published more than 100 papers. He published 3 books, and he taught many, many generations. Some of them are here with us today. So today we are celebrating Dr. Connelly's legacy through the lectureship that I am honored to be presenting only the second speaker in that lectureship. This lectureship is co-sponsored by 2 of our own, Wendy and Michael. Please look. Wendy was the former Dean of Libraries in University of Minnesota, and Michael Lujay obviously is a colleague and employed by our department. He still provides consultation for us all, informatics and otherwise. His background was in psychology, and he was never reluctant to provide me with certain sessions in my office to relieve my anxiety and tension. And thank you, Mike. I ran a tab. I know I didn't pay yet, but I will. So the speaker, coming to our speaker today, our speaker will be listed on this plaque. Your name will be here, Andy, right under Dr. Billis. Andy Evans, not to be mistaken with the other stand-up comedian, Andy Evans from Toronto. Andy Evans is also from Toronto. He was my colleague and a personal friend. We did so many crazy things together. We traveled across the world together. Andy's training initially was in GU pathology, but he led us in Toronto with the University of Toronto. He led us into digital pathology. He was the director of digital pathology. He shared validation of multiple systems, and he taught us everything. Everything I learned in digital pathology, I started on the hands of this man. Andy, we are so honored to have you here with us. He left University of Toronto to chair pathology in Mackenzie Health System. Mackenzie Health System is a beautiful facility if you can visit. That's in the neighborhood where I used to live. It's a 2 hospital, 2 campuses, and he's going to tell us that story, how he managed to lead 2 campuses through digital pathology. Andy?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Mahmoud. It's a real honor to be here, and I'd like to start off by expressing my condolences to the Connelly family. So, with any further ado, we'll head in. So, what I thought I would do would be to provide an overview of my own personal experience of the use of digital pathology for frozen sections across some diverse practice settings. And I've had the opportunity to do that in centers that are separated by 1 mile to over 350 miles. So I thought I would give you that. It won't be so much a how-to talk that we've heard. We've had some fabulous lectures earlier today on how to interpret frozen sections and pitfalls, etc. And this will concentrate more on just my experience and some workflow issues and lessons learned about digital itself. So here are the objectives really. At the end of the presentation, hopefully you'll be able to describe different digital pathology modalities that can be used for frozen section. And so I'll describe robotic capture and forward systems, whole slide imaging, and what we're using now where I'm working at Mackenzie Health, real-time video microscopy. And then my own personal experience with frozen section review across different practice settings. By way of disclosure, I did serve as a consultant for Verily Life Sciences / Google AI, and the development of some machine learning tools for prostate pathology, which is a very exciting area. I do not have any relationships with any digital pathology or AI vendor, so any products, names, et cetera, that I mentioned during the talk, they're simply vendor-client relationships. I always use this disclaimer when I give a presentation on my own personal frozen section experience with Digital Path, and the content reflects my experience over the last 19 years at 2 hospitals, University Health Network and Mackenzie Health. And depending on a variety of factors, the protocols and recommendations that I mention may or may not be practical or applicable in another institution. It's just what we've done and it's worked for us. So we'll start right off with the University Health Network experience. So starting way back in 2004, that's when my journey into digital pathology started. And truth be told, the way it came about was we were in the process of merging to a consolidated department from 3 separate sites, and it was going to leave no on-site pathologist at one of our sites where most of the neurosurgery was performed. So that would leave pathologists having to run back and forth, usually one pathologist at a time. And our department program medical director at the time, Dr. Sylvia Eza, came into a staff meeting and said she had seen a particular system in Europe that was used at the Charité hospitals in Berlin, and she thought that this might be something worth exploring to tackle the frozen section problem that we were going to face with a consolidated department, and she asked for volunteers who would be interested in moving it forward. No hands went up, self included. So the next day she came to my office, and I happened to be one of the earliest. It was shortly after I'd finished residency and fellowship. She came to my office, and I was one of the first pathologists in the department to get a microscope camera, a Leica microscope camera on top of my microscope to use for papers and tumor board rounds, etc. And so by default, I kind of became the master user, the subject matter expert for these microscope cameras. And so then by extension, she said, "Evans, you're the digital pathology guy, so I want you to have a look at it." I was a healthy skeptic to begin with, and then I'll describe how it evolved from there. But suffice to say, from 2004, when we started using it for frozen sections, it branched out into providing frozen section coverage at several other centers in Ontario. Delhi is well and truly familiar with the transplant biopsy service, particularly for liver biopsies, so we used digital pathology for that. Tried to establish a multi-jurisdictional telepathology consulting network in Canada. We used it for some consultation services for limited short-term contracts with 2 hospitals in the Middle East. And then finally in 2012, introduced it for primary sign-out in subspecialty areas at a hospital just east of Toronto, which I'll mention. So we had a variety of niche applications at UHN. It was a very unique opportunity. And many of the lessons that were learned all throughout the niche adoption cycle initially came from the first rollout in 2004. So this was our initial foray into Digital Path, and it was neuropathology frozen sections of the Toronto Western site. And so it generated upwards of 10 cases per week, as few as 2 and as many as 20. The most I ever did in one day was 17 from one case. It was probably the most challenging application we could have started with. As previous sessions had mentioned, speakers had mentioned, it's a time-sensitive activity. Frozen section morphology is often not the greatest compared to formalin. Greater chance of suboptimal samples, And overall, it's one of the most stressful activities that a pathologist can undertake. So here's a map just showing you the downtown of Toronto. So the red star is the consolidated site, that's Toronto General. And by 2006, we were fully consolidated there. A mile to the east, or to the west rather, the green star across the bottom on the diagonal, double-headed arrow there, that's the Toronto Western site, which is home to the Krembil Neurosciences Center, and that's where all the neuropathology, all of the neurosurgery procedures are performed. And as of 2004, there was no longer going to be an on-site neuropathologist. So then we were, tasked with the challenge of either moving slides, moving pathologists, or looking at digital, and that's how the digital idea was born. So what drove it forward, really? The fact that we had a single pathologist traveling from Toronto General to Toronto Western. Well, that's inefficient because you travel and you wait. You could, despite the best laid plans, you could get there 15, 20 minutes before an anticipated frozen section, and then something happens in the OR, scheduling change, some intraoperative challenge such as bleeding, etc., and you don't get your frozen section, and you can't leave, so you're just going to sit there and wait. It's disruptive to your regular workflow back in your office. Back in those days, we certainly weren't all digital, so we were very much wedded to glass slides for routine reporting, and that also involved resident teaching, resident sign-out, and so this had the potential to affect other UHN patients because of delayed diagnoses. And then finally, on difficult cases, where you might want to consider deferring, and then the usual response of the neurosurgeon is, if you don't know what it is, find me a pathologist who does. And so then the fact that you could share it around with multiple colleagues in real time, we felt very strongly that improved quality. So we tried to avoid the potential of affecting Toronto Western neurosurgical patients. So that for all those reasons, those were the value propositions. And what we started with actually was a robotic microscope from Leica. And you can see, if we look over here, this was the viewing screen. This was a thumbnail with a reticle that you could see where your objective was positioned on the slide. You could adjust the magnification by clicking on these going all the way up to 40x or even 60x actually. And then you could adjust the direction of the movement of the stage with the direction arrows, and then using the sliding scale across the bottom, you could adjust the illumination. So fantastic device. The problem was every single manipulation of this microscope was another JPEG image that was caught, and it would take 1 to 1.5 seconds to come across the network. So as a result, if you had to take the lawnmower approach and go across a section, a frozen section or a smear very slowly, it could take you up to 10 minutes to review one slide. So it worked. It was the morphology was fantastic, but it was slow. And then we heard Dr. Nakla talk about the frozen section turnaround time requirement. And so we were usually up against it, the 20-minute barrier in almost every frozen section we got, but it did work. And because of the slow speed, around that time there was a researcher in our department who had access to an Apereo Scanscope CS, and he was trialing it out, and he came by my office one day and said, you guys should really look at this for the frozen sections. So we went through and did a retrospective validation on a series of cases, and it provided a viewing experience that was much more like a regular microscope and was certainly faster. And I'll show you how well it worked. So from then on in 2006, we implemented the Apereo Scanscope, looked at over 6,000 frozen sections by the time I had left. The vast majority from neurosurgery. Our discrepancy rates from year to year versus final were, in some years we had no discrepancies, and we had upwards of 2%. So it was every bit as good as glass. In terms of turnaround time, 14 to 16 minutes total, and I'll show you how that breaks out. Our deferral rate was less than 2%, and then from a quality perspective, as I mentioned, we could always have 2 pathologists review any case, at least 2, before we provided a deferral to a surgeon, to a neurosurgeon, who was going to say, if you don't know what it is, find me a pathologist who does. So we could counteract that before we got the comment. In terms of the workflow, we were blessed actually at the time with a lead histotechnologist at the Toronto Western site that could cut frozen sections that looked like most people's permanents. Her name was Siganthi. And I would show these things at conferences, and they were accusing me of academic misconduct that I was showing paraffin sections. But these are actually her frozens. They were exquisite. And she would also prepare wonderful smears. And so in this meningioma, you can see how the smear and the frozen section would complement one another. And one of the things that we looked at for the squash preps was, as Liam had mentioned in his presentation about the thick portion of the smear, you really can't interpret much from that. But like a peripheral blood film, if you go out on the thinner portion, then you get the cytologic detail that you see, you'll see here, and over on the right side, right there. And so what we would do is concentrate our scanning of the slide actually from there out to the end of the tail. So that was going to give us the best morphology, the best focus, and then we were always using it in conjunction with a frozen section. So that was something that we developed, and everyone was very happy with it, including our 2 board-certified neuropathologists. So this is how the workflow would break out. We took roughly 10 to 12 minutes after the tissue was received in the lab to cut, stain, cover slip, and scan a slide. And then the first slide that would go in for scanning would be the frozen section, and which would take generally less than a minute to scan because they were small pieces of tissue. While the pathologist was working on the frozen section, the smear was scanning because it was a larger area and would take a little bit longer. And then a total of 1 to 3 minutes interpretation time on average, and our turnaround time was well within the 20-minute benchmark. We didn't have a problem with it there. And of course, it could go out to longer if we had to bring 1 or more pathologists in to have a look. And the nice thing about it being digital is they didn't have to leave their office to do it. So we could just pick up the phone and call them. They didn't have to come from another part of the department. Another reason for the success of the program was having the cryostat and the scanner in the same room and basically side by side. So the workflow was very smooth. So we had why it worked. It was a clearly defined application. The vast majority were neuropath frozen sections. Is it normal or abnormal tissue? Is it neoplastic or non-neoplastic? If it's neoplastic, is it a primary CNS lesion or is it secondary? Just as Liam had outlined, kind of those basic details to give to the surgeon. As I mentioned, a very quite uncomplicated frozen section workflow. It wasn't a busy frozen section lab, so it's not like you would have multiple frozen sections coming from several ORs at the same time. So the technologist histotechs could focus on the task at hand. We took 18 months to develop it, including validation, which was importantly allowed us to build confidence and trust, carry out some due diligence. At the time, because it was really new for any lab in Canada, our first and most important stop in terms of due diligence was with our medical malpractice insurance provider, who said, so long as you've done a proper validation up front, you've documented that you've identified potential risks and ways to mitigate the risks, you've carried out your due diligence, you've done what a reasonable practitioner would do. And so for that, that would have been the deal breaker. If they had said, no, this is too risky, I wouldn't be here giving you this talk. In terms of the implementation, I can't say enough. It does require a team approach, a committed group of pathologists. We started out with a very small group. Generally, if you try to roll out a digital path to a large group of pathologists, you will get people absolutely for sure who will be naysayers and will prevent things from moving forward. Not that the naysayers don't have really good ideas and cautions that we should all be aware of, but it's much easier when you start with a small group where everyone is on the same page. Also, histotechnologists and PAs carried out delegated tasks. I can't say enough about dedicated IT support, and importantly for us, early engagement of the Toronto Western surgeons, because we weren't going to have a pathologist on site. And we didn't want for the situation to arise where something might go wrong and we'll say, well, the frozen section diagnosis is going to be delayed because the scanner is down. And the surgeon says, what's a scanner? What are you doing? So at least we wanted them to know. We took the time to bring them to the lab and show them exactly what we were doing. Now, despite that, we tried to target the surgeons who were going to be the largest providers of frozen sections. And so we got them in, gave them the tour, they knew what was happening. But occasionally there would be surgeons that would come from other sites at University Health Network to join in combined surgery. So in one particular example, there was a thoracic surgeon that joined a neurosurgeon who specialized in brachial plexus tumors to resect a Pancoast tumor, a lung cancer post-radiation. And they were submitting all kinds of margins and little biopsies to see if there was viable tumor. So the neurosurgeon was busy working. I was giving the frozen section diagnoses to the thoracic surgeon who wasn't scrubbed in. And it came up in conversation that I was not at the Toronto Western site, that I was at Toronto General. And he said, well, how are you reading these frozen sections? And I told him, I said, no, we're reading it using a robotic microscope. We're doing it by telepathology. And he took the phone away from his ear, and this is what I heard him say. Hey, they're reading these frozens by telepathy. And whenever you embark on something like this, you have to come up with, you have to expect the system could fail. So you need a plan B. So the plan B here that we put in place as an SOP was the pathologist informs the surgeon that something had gone wrong with the scanner. And typically if the problem could not be resolved within 5 minutes, then a pathologist would have to go over to Toronto Western, while the initial pathologist would stay behind and work remotely with the histotechnologist at Toronto Western in the event that the issue could be resolved. And occasionally we actually did sort it out before the other pathologist got there. And then the modes of transport to get over, we had a shuttle, we had cab, we had rental bikes, and this was my preferred one because I like to run, so I would just kind of jog over there. And so in terms of the causes and the incidence of mid-case failure, during the time that I was there, there were fewer than 20 episodes out of over 6,000 frozen sections, so 0.3%. So the take-home message is 99.7% of the time it was reliable and it worked, but you have to expect that it can fail. It's not zero. So you need to come up with some type of a protocol. And these were the examples of where it did fail. Small pieces of tissue, very pale. We are actually able to work with the vendor to establish what they called a faint slide protocol that eventually did capture those pieces of tissue. And this could come up with brain tumors, that particularly if they were edematous. This one is probably the most dramatic one, right here. So we made sure that the techs were paying meticulous attention to wiping excess mounting media off of the slides after they were cover slipped, because you're putting a wet slide in the scanner, and if any mounting media gets up on top of the cover slip, it can stick to the objective, and then when the stage is homing into position, you'll crush the cover slip. That happened one time, and it was quite dramatic. The tech phoned my office, and she said, you're going to have to come over here because the objective is completely fouled with mounting media. And she was hearing, as the slide was homing into position to start the scan, she heard this god-awful crunching sound. And there's a little trap door in the side of the scan scope, and she peeked inside and saw the cover slip was just demolished. So that was, one lesson learned. Just as can happen with a regular microscope, your light source can burn out on a microscope. And so you have to do an emergency light switch or run to find another microscope. So this happened. Calibration errors and stage homing and sensor failure. Those were the other reasons. Now, one thing that we did in terms of SOP that we learned very early on, and I've carried forward to every application that we've used digital pathology for in terms of frozen section, scan a test slide every morning. Deli had mentioned it. Because this will unearth things such as unexpected local network failure, where a slide could scan, everything would be fine at the Toronto Western site, but at the Toronto General site there was something down, and then we couldn't connect with that scanner. And so you want to make sure you identify those things before the frozen sections arrive, so then you can go into Plan B and have someone over there to keep things going. Other things, scanner issues, background calibration issues, particularly if the light source was fading. That was a lesson that we learned over time. If the light bulb was ending its lifespan, we would notice calibration issues. And a dirty objective. So if you did get some mounting media on the slide or on the objective and it dried, you would get this film, and then you would get this striping that you're seeing here. Where you see blurry on the right-hand end of one stripe, and it's perfectly focused on the left-hand end, and that would just repeat itself all the way across the slide. So then the objective could be cleaned again before frozen sections arrive. The other thing we learned was the importance of image quality and good histology. So very much it's poor slides, poor images, or said in a crude way, garbage in, garbage out. We scanned all of these things at 20x up front, 40x if you needed to. And then on the right-hand side, this was from a chordoma, so it was beautiful morphology there. Does anyone know what this one is? Liam will probably know this right off the bat. This was one of the wackiest frozen sections I ever got. So the story was a young lady who had been traveling in Central America. And when she returned, she developed some balance problems. And then imaging was done, and it was a solid and cystic lesion. There was a mural nodule. And the surgeon that sent this was a bit of a joker. I had looked at the imaging, and I was there with a neuropathologist colleague, and we'd looked at it, and we could see this thing. And he was saying, he was trying to get us to believe that it was either a hemangioblastoma, an ependymoma, or a pilocytic astrocytoma. And what he submitted was a worm. So this was the sucker of a neurocystosarcosis of a tapeworm. So that was one of the most interesting frozens I think I've ever had. And that was digital. In terms of the histology, air bubbles and tissue folds are your worst enemy. If you're trying to use whole slide imaging, it just won't work well. So again, it speaks to the need for really good quality frozen sections and a highly skilled person to carry out that task. Now if we move away from the Toronto Western to some of the more remote sites, we next implemented frozen sections in a place called Timmins, and here it is here. So there's Toronto down there at the bottom, and as the crow flies, 342 miles, and by car 426 miles. And so it was a general community hospital, 10,000 surgical pathology accessions per year, and UHN assumed medical leadership of the Timmins and District Hospital labs in 2006. In terms of pathologist staffing, there was only one pathologist on site at any given time. That was 3 weeks out of every month, and 1 week there was no one there. And so the plan was to try and have surgeons do frozen sections when there was one pathologist there. For the 1 week per month, we implemented digital path to provide frozen sections support, and also to provide quality assurance support to the one pathologist who was on site. So when there was no pathologist there, we would look at no more than 150 frozen sections per year. They were typically tissue identification or intraoperative staging, something incidentally found that they would submit. In terms of system architecture, our plan B, because you're not going to jog to Timmins in an acceptable period of time. So we had built-in redundancy. We had 2 scanners, we had multiple links, and during the time that I was there were no mid-case failures at Timmins for frozen sections. And then the frozen section workflow was initiated by a pager. So we asked, I think we heard in one of the previous presentations this morning, the value of getting a heads up from the OR before the tissue is being sent. So then the person carrying the pager in Toronto would get a call, connect with the lab in Timmins, find out what was coming, and then we would report directly to the surgeon by telephone. There was another story after I had finished reporting a frozen section there one day. As it turned out, the surgeon was a locum surgeon who wasn't aware of how we were doing the frozen sections. The regular staff knew. And so he said when he was done in the procedure, he would scrub out and come down to the pathology lab to talk to me about some other case. And I had to tell him that one of us would have to get on a plane if that was going to be a face-to-face conversation. So he didn't know. As I mentioned, we also used it for pathologist-to-pathologist consultation when there was a pathologist on site. This was one of the more interesting frozen sections I had, like as a GU pathologist there. It was a testicular tumor, and we don't, I guess Perry had mentioned in his presentation, we don't very often get frozen sections from testicular masses. And I looked at it and saw 3 different cell types, and I thought to myself, I wonder if this is a spermatocytic tumor. But anyway, I held back. I didn't want to get too fancy. I said it's compatible with a germ cell tumor. And on the paraffin section, it actually was a spermatocytic tumor. So I was quite impressed with the morphology of it. Next one was Kingston General. This one is an academic pathology department. The task for digital there was neuropath frozen section coverage. They had a very low volume of intraoperative consults, only 1 to 5 per week. They had 1 staff neuropathologist who covered all of these cases, but if he was away or doing teaching at the university, etc., there was need for backup because his non-neuropath colleagues did not like looking at these cases. So we agreed to take this on from Toronto. They already had an Aperio scanner that they were using for teaching purposes, so we went through a validation process and we were off to the races there. We were given limited consulting privileges. There were 3 of us that took part in the service. We had complete access to their electronic patient record, could review all the diagnostic imaging, prepare for the frozen sections exactly as we did at Toronto Western. And in terms of reporting, we had remote access to their lab information system. So it was really quite seamless. And here, this one, the plan B for system failure, well, there's always a pathologist on site at Kingston General Hospital, and if push came to shove, they could review it. And in the time that I was there, it didn't happen. There were no mid-case failures in 8 years. And there's the distance between Toronto and Kingston, 163 miles. In terms of dollars and cents, I mean, this one for UHN was a bit of a no-brainer. There was no implementation cost because they had the scanner. They had service contracts. They were providing all the service, etc., maintaining the instrument. They did eventually switch to a hybrid video microscopy device, the Leica LV1. And that was just around the time that I left to my new position at Mackenzie Health. And in terms of the cents, you know, the KGH pathologists and neurosurgeons got UHN support for neuropath frozen sections. And for our efforts, we were able to bill for the service on a case-by-case basis. So it was the closest thing to a win-win situation. Now we come to Lakeridge Bowmanville. So Lakeridge Health, it's a very large community hospital. It's designated as a regional cancer center, and they had in Oshawa, Ontario, which is roughly 40 miles from downtown Toronto. And if you push out another 8 miles to the east, you reach this small town, Bowmanville. And in the community hospital there was one plastic surgeon who happened to be a former medical school classmate of mine, who would submit frozen section cases for excisions of usually basal cell carcinomas around the eye. And so we were able to cajole him into drawing these beautiful diagrams and placing the piece of tissue. It's actually on the wrapper for sterile surgical gloves. He would just draw position of the tumor relative to the eye and orient it, and then we could take it from there and do the margins around the clock face and report back. So now we move to Mackenzie Health. So where I am now, so it's as Mahmoud mentioned in the introduction, very large two-site community hospital, currently 682 beds. There are 2 shelled floors on the new site, the Cortellucci Vaughan Hospital, that when they're built out for patient care, it'll take us to 900 beds. So a very large hospital. Serves a catchment area of over 500,000 people, and it's rapidly growing. The original site was the Richmond Hill Hospital, and it opened in 1963, and the Cortellucci Vaughan Hospital opened in February 2021 in the midst of the pandemic. And when it first opened, it was designated by the Ontario Ministry of Health as a pandemic overflow hospital. So on the very first day that it opened, the patient census went from 0 patients to 300 in pretty much 24 hours. And most of them were active COVID cases. And it stayed that way until June of 2021 when it opened for general service. So these are the two sites. I think the key date to keep in mind was January 25th, 2021 for the digital applications that I'll mention, because that's when the pathology department moved out of its historical location for many pathology departments in the basement of the Richmond Hill site to the 3rd floor of the Cortellucci Vaughan Hospital. We currently have 8 full-time pathologists, and then we have 3 what I refer to as virtual associate courtesy staff pathologists who provide subspecialty support for us and handle cases in breast, gynae, and GI when we get slammed with huge volumes of cases. And the beauty is they're all very comfortable with digital, and they don't have to come on site to report. They can do it from home. So that's one definite benefit of digital. In terms of the case volumes, we're 24,000, on track for 24,000 accessions for 2023, and then that's only going to grow, especially when the 2 additional shelled floors are built out. In terms of its location, the Cortellucci Vaughan is right across from a very large theme park, Canada's Wonderland. And this is actually the view from my office. This roller coaster is known as Leviathan. And I sometimes chuckle when I come into work, especially when I first moved to the Cortellucci Vaughan Hospital. When I drive in, I literally work at the intersection of wellness and amusement. So if you hang a left, you go into the hospital. If you hang a right, you go into Canada's Wonderland. Now, I can say that this particular intersection has been under construction for most of the last 2 years. So many mornings, it is neither wellness promoting nor is it amusing. You just sit in traffic waiting to get in. So I did mention that Mackenzie Health has gone completely digital for surgical path reporting, which doesn't mean we don't use glass slides, but all the front-end assessment is done digitally. Every single slide is scanned. And so often get the question about, well, what's the return on investment? What's the business case? Where you look at the cost to implement, the cost you might save, the revenue you would generate, balance this equation, and do you get a return on your investment in 3 to 5 years? And if you take this very narrow approach to things, focusing only on the lab and costs, that business case is going to fail, so there's no business case to do it, and this has been a main reason why a lot of labs won't implement. The leadership at Mackenzie Health adopted a different strategy. They went for a strategic investment approach. They embraced the idea that digital pathology is a new paradigm. It's required for contemporary practice going forward. And it would be an essential platform to incorporate AI into routine practice whenever that happens. So for that reason, they decided to forget about a business case, to proceed with a strategic investment. And this is how, and then from there, they came knocking on my door and asked if I would relocate. And so they had set up a complete system by the time I got there, and my task was really to try and operationalize it. So from the view of senior leadership, this was their view of the strategic investment. So it was a corporate decision. It was made in 2018 that Mackenzie Health Pathology is going digital. The plan was to transition to full digital pathology for surgical pathology cases over 2 to 3 years in association of opening the new hospital. So the brand new hospital was built, purpose-built for as much digital medicine as one could carry out. And that included any specialty where digital images would be involved. They made a $4 to $5 million investment in pathology and lab medicine. They thought that this would retain pathologists through flexibility in terms of working conditions, increased quality for patients through enhanced collaboration with subspecialty access, which would require connecting with other pathology departments in Ontario and internationally, and a platform on which to implement AI. And this was actually a quote on the bottom from our Chief Executive Officer, Altaf Stationwala. And he said, there's no business case for an MRI scanner in a large hospital. It's a tool you have to practice, and this is how, this is his view. It's not going to fly in every institution, but this was his view for pathology going forward. In terms of our implementation journey, as I mentioned, the process really began in 2018. Scanners were purchased, implemented. They went with the Philips system, the ultra-fast system, the first one that was FDA approved. The validation study was conducted. Some risks were identified from the validation that had to be addressed. And then the go-live was around the time that I arrived in August of 2020. But we didn't go directly to, no more glass slides, get rid of your microscopes. Pathologists still, after the validation period, were given all the glass slides for their cases, and they could pick and choose how they use digital and work through the implementation journey at their own rate. And this is what I would say full adoption looks like. So in January of 2021, these were all the glass slides that were routinely delivered every day. And by May 11th, that was the day the last pathologist came and said, please stop delivering the glass, I'll ask for it when I need it. And that's what the boxes look like now. The only glass slides that go in there would be cytology cases and glass slides when pathologists request them. So this is the system that we have, the two Philips ultra-fast scanners. They're fully integrated with Epic. And then from there, you can click on that hyperlink that's up in the top there with the red oval, and that will launch all of the slides for your case. Everything is 2D barcode enabled, etc. Office workstations, so we have a 3-monitor setup there. This is my office. You can see the microscope is plainly evident. Still use it. And I don't think for the rest of my career it's going anywhere. We use it for cytology and when I need it for glass slide review on difficult cases or where image quality is not up to scratch. The hospital also provided, which was invaluable to everyone during the pandemic, provided hospital issued and supported home workstations. And so we have just a 2-monitor system at home. We have exactly the same PC tower, input devices. We have multi-factor authentication, protected access to a virtual desktop. So more or less I have access to my office at home. And so we did conduct a prospective validation study where we used a representative case mix. And the group of us worked through 282 cases, first reviewed remotely at home, enter in your diagnosis into Epic, but don't sign the case out. And then the next day, come and review the glass slides, make notes of any discordances. And from all of that, there was only one minor discordance. And what it was actually was one pathologist missed a few neutrophils in a prostate biopsy. And then went back and looked at the digital slide again and saw that they in fact were there. So from that perspective, we considered the system validated and started using it. And it was invaluable, particularly to my colleagues that had school-aged children during the pandemic, where school was continually pivoting between in-person and Zoom or online. And sometimes on a moment's notice, if there was an outbreak in a particular classroom or a school, they would have to drop what they were doing. And so this allowed people to keep the diagnostic work going. A question I get quite frequently is, how do you store these images? Well, there's no etched in stone standard for retention of images used for diagnostic purposes. I think it's fair to say that most labs in the United States, certainly in the Ohio State, who we work very closely with, my friend Anil Parwani there, they're working on an archive that basically replicates the CAP requirement for retaining slides for 10 years. So that's what we've started to do. And it's, we've been doing this now for 3 years, so we still have 7 years worth of space before we have to worry about adjusting a policy. But I think this is something that will click into place. The Digital and Computational Pathology Committee within the CAP is actively working on a strategy for image retention, and the current chair is Dr. Marilyn Bowie at Moffitt. So this is the system that we use. The images come off the two scanners, go into a Philips image management system, and they're stored on just a storage area network that takes, at the current rate of slide scanning, and we generate about 14,000 slides per month. To put that into perspective, Memorial Sloan Kettering and Mount Sinai in New York would generate 27,000 slides a week. So much higher volumes than we do. So this takes roughly 2 years to fill up, 730 days, and then they automatically push out to a cold storage second tier, just a network storage, which is a Dell Isilon scale out that is easily scalable. We simply add more server racks as required. And this is all on premises. We don't use clouds. And so this is the reason why we didn't use a cloud solution. We found it to be much cheaper. For us, clouds were very expensive. It was less than half the cost for us, and we had a brand new hospital. There was really no retrofitting involved. We had 2 physically separate data centers, so we could actually back these slides up in 2 physically separate locations for 10 years. Also, what we found with the analysis with the cloud solution is the more you put in, the more expensive it gets. And then there can be these hidden retrieval costs. Every time you click on a slide to pull something out, there can be charges depending on the provider that you use. The retrieval is faster, fewer layers, firewalls, network switches, etc., doing it on premises. We already have our own 24/7 mission critical monitoring. So if you invoke a cloud system, you're paying for another layer of that. And as I mentioned, the system that our IT folks designed is scalable well out into the petabyte range. So for our purposes, this works. Coming to frozen sections, so we don't get very many frozen sections at Mackenzie Health. So these, going back to the map, the pathologists are sitting here at Cortellucci Vaughan, and 5.5 miles away is the Richmond Hill site. And so the Richmond Hill site has no on-site pathologist, but we do have pathologist assistants and medical lab technologists there who can handle frozen sections. The vast majority of frozen sections that we get are parathyroids. They're from head and neck surgeons. Please identify and confirm parathyroid tissue. Tell us if it's cellular parathyroid tissue, if they think they have hyperplasia or an adenoma. If we ever did need to review something grossly, what we found works really well is to take an iPad with a high-resolution camera and put it on a gooseneck, and then use MS Teams, and it works very well. We do use TeamViewer, so it's as an intermediary connectivity software. The device that we use for frozen sections is a hybrid device, so it's a hybrid whole slide imaging real-time video microscope from Sakura. And then we connect it to the pathologist computers either at home or in the office. We typically don't read frozen sections from home unless they were to come after hours. But we rely on this TeamViewer connection. So it's important in a couple of slides as to why how this is done. In terms of preparation before going live, we followed the exact same thing that I had set up for the Toronto Western. So you have to train all the users, do a validation study representing the mix of cases to be expected, develop an SOP, workflow, assignment of tasks, so everyone knows what they're doing, use of high-resolution webcam, as I mentioned, for gross review if required. We did a number of dry runs to establish turnaround time benchmarks, and then developed a downtime procedure which would involve a pathologist going to Richmond Hill from the CVH site. And to this point in time, in 3 years, that has not happened. Importantly, engaging surgical colleagues, again, I can't stress that the value of doing that enough, so that if something does go wrong, you can, the surgeon, you're not having to explain to the surgeon anything about scanners and digital pathology. And so we completed all of that. If you remember, I mentioned the date of January 25th, 2021. That was when we moved from Richmond Hill to the AEvans site. So all of this had to be completed by that time. So we were able to get it done actually 6 weeks in advance of the move. And so in terms of the validation study, I'll just take you through very quickly what we did. Picked retrospective frozen section cases. There were 53 of them. And going through there, 51 of 53 had exact concordance, 96%. We took one representative frozen section from each case. I ended up picking them, so I didn't participate in the validation because I'd be hopelessly biased. Each pathologist reviewed 10 slides. They reviewed them first by the Sakura, and then 1 week later they reviewed them as glass slides. So that would generate, there were a total of 60 slides that we ended up picking, and had to get rid of some because they weren't satisfactory. So the idea was to collect 120 data points. Now I did pick overlapping cases, so 13 of the slides were reviewed by 2 pathologists, and that was done on purpose because they were very difficult frozens, and we wanted to see how different pathologists would tackle the same slide. And so the idea was, the endpoint of the study is, what would you tell the surgeon based on this one slide? Would you tell them you needed deeper levels? Would you tell them you had to show to others? Would you defer, or would you come out with a definitive frozen section diagnosis? So the endpoint here was just concordance between Sakura and glass. And so that was the exact concordance that I mentioned. The 2 discordant cases were difficult ones that were both reviewed by 2 pathologists. And I'll show you one example of that here. So this one was a peritoneal nodule biopsy in an 88-year-old male with known gastric cancer. And so the question was this recurrent disease? The 2018 frozen section diagnosis was malignant cells seen, see comment. And in the final diagnosis, it was poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma, likely gastric origin. So in the validation study, pathologist 1 on the Sakura said, suspicious for metastatic carcinoma, will show another pathologist. And on the glass slide, the same person said, oh, this is negative for malignancy. It's important. Normally people will think that when you're doing these validation studies, you're doing it to show how inferior the digital is. Here, in this case, the interpretive error was actually made on the glass slide, not on the digital. And then the second one, the pathologist agreed, both on the Sakura and the glass, that it was positive for malignancy, and even went so far on the Sakura to say signet ring cells. And so this was that frozen section. It was quite a challenging one. And there you can see the signet ring cells. And those are just screen caps from the Sakura. So coming back to the value of the daily connectivity check. So here are 2 unique examples. So I mentioned the use of TeamViewer to connect the 2 systems together. So if the pathologist on this given day did not check to see if it was working, they would have been very disappointed if a frozen section had arrived. And this was the failure mode. So there was an overdue invoice. So it actually had been paid the week before, but the TeamViewer accounting had not processed it. So then when the pathologist went to this was on a Monday morning, when they went to log on to the system, it showed that the invoice hadn't been paid and they were blocking access to it. So something to consider if you're using intermediary software to connect. Make sure your bills are paid. But again, the value of the connectivity check, because if the person hadn't done that, they wouldn't have found this. The other thing, the second example here was the IT department. TeamViewer is used for other purposes at Mackenzie Health, and they, in their wisdom, went and made some changes to user profiles for every single user. They didn't tell anyone that they'd done it. It was done in the background on a weekend. Again, this was on a Monday morning. And the changes resulted in blocked Sakura access, and central password resets were required. So we had to go through the IT department to get all of this sorted out. And the interesting thing was that IT made the changes and they were unaware of how we were using the system. So another caveat. And again, the only way this was discovered was because of the daily system check. So I think that's, if I give you one take-home message, if you set up this technology for frozen section coverage, daily system check every morning. So this is what we covered. Hopefully I did hit on all of those objectives, and that this was interesting and useful. I certainly enjoyed all the presentations that went before. And so just by way of acknowledgements, these are some of the people from my colleagues from UHN who really made this system go. And as I say, I can't say enough about this person, Suganthi, who was the histotechnologist, just blessed with a skill to cut incredible frozen sections. And she was really the main reason why we were really able to launch this. And then also from the Mackenzie Health side, again, it takes a team. I did mention the senior leadership and their vision to support the digital path rollout. All of the pathologists involved, our lab management, and our highly skilled pathologist assistant and histotechnologists. Remember, the slide image quality for diagnostic purposes is really heavily tied to the quality of slides you put in these devices. We have LIS support, IT support. We're blessed with having basically 5 people who are dedicated to covering radiology and pathology applications. So there's always someone available to help, and of course, vendors. And I can't say enough, it's a tremendous honor to give this lecture in Dr. Connelly's name and in his honor. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evans. Any questions for Dr. Evans? Yes, please.
I wonder about the impact on staffing, pathologists, PAs, and histotechs, and also the throughput or the productivity of the individual pathologists. Are they getting through same number of cases?
For the primary sign-out?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so the first thing was, in terms of impact on the lab, we did have to hire two additional 1.0 FTE histotechnologists to handle the workflow. And so currently where the extra person power there is used is like for 2 reasons. One, our lab is, now that we've moved from a 1-site to a 2-site operation, the volumes are much greater. So we've seen a 30% increase in the last year alone. The second thing is we have histotechnologists who are trained, have taken the National Society for Histotechnologists Digital Pathology Association certificate in digital path. And so they really have a good solid understanding of the issues of digital path and histology and image quality. So we have them performing quality control reads on all the slides that come off the scanner before they're given to a pathologist. So that's where the extra person power on the histotech side came in. If you look on the pathologist side, initially, of course, with a new technology, your throughput is going to fall, because you're going to be reviewing cases in parallel, glass and digital. But as you develop that all-important comfort level, then you will transition away from having to review glass slides before you can sign out a report. And you saw how that was done. Across the group of colleagues, after a validation study was completed, it took another 9 months before the last pathologist said, "Don't give me glass anymore, I'll call for it when I need it." Now, one point to be made there is that while you're doing this double reading, I get the question quite frequently is, did Mackenzie Health pay its pathologists more to do double reads, or did you hire extra pathologists? Well, if you remember, I said a lot of this rollout was done during the pandemic. And in the province of Ontario, as I'm sure probably happened in Minnesota, scheduled care was reduced quite dramatically to preserve bed space for COVID patients. So at some points, our workload had dropped to 20 to 30% of normal. And during that time, pathologists felt much less time pressure to sign out cases, so they could review cases in parallel and develop that all-important comfort level without being time pressured to get their reports out. So that was one, I would say a silver lining to the pandemic. Obviously an awful situation, but for us in terms of the adoption of digital, it was a definite benefit. And now most of my colleagues will tell you they're faster on digital than they are on glass. And going through cases, going from one slide to the next, you can absolutely go through cases, through slides more quickly with just clicking on your input device to advance to the next slide. It's much faster than reaching across to a tray and grabbing a glass slide and slapping it on the stage. In terms of identifying areas of interest, all of my colleagues will tell you they feel they can do it much more efficiently and effectively at an overview image. But again, you have to develop that trust that what you're seeing on that slide at a lower resolution overview image, that you're not missing something. And the only way you can do that, in my experience and my opinion, is through double review of slides, glass, digital, thousands of slides, and then eventually you'll get there. And people move through that process at their own rate. So having said all that, we've been actually able to absorb a 30% increase in workload in the last year with the same number of pathologists. So now that's not sustainable. So one of my tasks that's perhaps causing me to lose sleep at night is bargaining with the administration of the hospital to create 2 new positions, which we badly need.
Last question. Oh.
I think it's phenomenal what you said. It's phenomenal what you said about the overflow pathologists and consultants that you use. They sign from their home. If you need them,
yep.
They have privileges.
They do. Yep, they do. So, Deli, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I have a question. And now talking about different jurisdictions, I know there are probably a lot of similarities between the US and Canada, but also a lot of differences. So what's the impact of regulatory agencies around things like the platform to adopt? So I know you went with Philips. And also importantly, in the US, you have to sign out under a clear license, right? So if I'm going to be doing that routinely, remotely, there are different ways that we are still not sure about of how to regulate. So in Canada, and especially if you're going to be recommending it to other departments in Canada, what is the impact of these regulatory agencies around your adoption?
Well, I think the first point to keep in mind for regulatory agencies like the FDA or in Canada, Health Canada, is they don't regulate the practice of medicine directly, or pathology or what pathologists do. They regulate the claims that vendors make about their products. So that's the first thing. So if you implement digital pathology and you've implemented it as a lab-developed test, recognizing that landscape could change with the FDA's intentions of somehow getting into monitoring lab-developed tests, LDTs, et cetera. But you don't, if you're using digital pathology for diagnostic purposes, and it's not an FDA-approved device, the FDA doesn't send police officers to take you away in handcuffs. So, that's where the due diligence piece comes in. So that's the first part about the regulatory agencies. The second thing is in terms of jurisdiction, if you're in, you would need credentials at every hospital where you're going to be issuing primary diagnoses, which is what we had at UHN. So I had credentials at Timmins, at Sioux area, at Lakeridge, and at Kingston. To do all of those services. So that was absolutely required. I didn't need a special license because it was all in the province of Ontario. At one point, we were doing some coverage for a hospital in Newfoundland, but by glass slides, not by digital. Now, I did require, there was a licensure requirement or a waiver that was required for me to do primary diagnoses on prostate biopsies that originated from Newfoundland. So if you go, just like in the US, if you go across a state line or across a provincial line for primary diagnosis, you need a license in that state where the patient is. So that would be, those would be the two considerations, I think.
I know that we are running a little bit late, but there is quite a bit of interest and more questions. So,
Sure.
Dr. Moisini.
So I have a very practical question. You said you have 8 pathologists at your location? 8. At any time, how many of them can and will work from home?
We've had, it depends. If you look on, say, for example, a Friday coming into a holiday weekend, you'll probably have 5 of them working from home. And one of the things, and we've had, so we've been able to make this work quite well. So as department chief, I've kind of laid down a bit of a rule that if you're working from home, it's not a part day off. If someone needs you, they need you. So you shouldn't be, sign out a few cases and go play a few sets of tennis or hit some golf balls and then come back and do more. That's not on.
Okay.
So if somebody needs you, they need you. The second thing is in terms of consultation, so if we need a particular person for a quality assurance read, so we have a policy for every new malignancy, it has to be independently reviewed by another pathologist prior to sign out. So if the most appropriate person to review it is at home, we do have a system in Epic where you can initiate the what's called a follow-up task request, and it will populate a list and a work list in Epic for them, and they'll see that they need, the pathologist has asked them to review a particular case. They can go ahead and do that, enter a QA, and of course if it's really a stat request, then you pick up the phone and call them or reach out by email. So we've made that work quite well. Another point I would raise, just since you brought up the work from home situation, is in terms of deferral to glass, that was a really big problem. And it was creating tremendous inefficiencies. You would never have the number of pathologists we have that would be willing to work from home, and they don't feel that they're engaging in risky practice. So if they need to see a glass slide, there is a mechanism again in Epic where they can go in, literally just type the word pull under Case Builder if you're familiar with Epic, and then a drop-down will appear, and you click on pull slides, and the slides will be available in the box the next morning when you come in.
Right, and you mentioned it's $3,000 to set up the system at home. You just requested the hospital, there's a team who comes to your house and sets it up?
Well, I mean, I set up mine myself. I'm quite comfortable doing it, but for others who were not so technically savvy, yes.
And what exactly is $3,000? The software on your personal computer at home?
No, the computer, the monitors, the input devices.
So everything.
And the microphone for the voice recognition dictation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It's Brooke Gagnier from Fairview Labs.
I could probably ask questions for the rest of the evening. So it sounds like some of the quality of the slides or sections improved for the pathologists with the digital platform. Did you notice a reduction in the need for recuts on slides at all for the pathologists, or did you look at that?
I would say overall no. And then I would say during the transition period, you're talking about asking for additional levels on things.
Yeah.
I would say that during the transition period, it probably increased.
Okay.
I can't give you an exact figure, and it varied by the pathologist. I would say the take-home message there is that each pathologist's adoption journey is quite specific to them and to their practice. The most interesting thing about it was that the 2 most senior pathologists in our group were the first to say, I don't want glass anymore. The last person to drop off was the most junior person. who will still pull glass slides and look at selected slides in upwards of 10 to 15% of her cases before she signs them out. But everything, she's very comfortable on the front end, looking at cases, and then the percentage of cases where she pulls a glass slide to dot I's and cross T's, or just to reassure herself, is steadily dropping.
And then I guess from the histotech perspective, you had said you had to get additional FTEs on the histology side to support it.
We added 2.
So I'm just thinking like, the distribution and slide filing, you did not gain efficiencies from those things?
Yeah, well, so we're talking now about medical lab assistants, or MLAs, versus medical lab technologists. So we hired 2 additional medical lab technologists. The medical lab assistants are the ones that do the filing, and they actually find it to be much more efficient because they put the slides away as soon as they leave the scanner. So there's no hunting for them. And if they have to go out, that's a huge efficiency that we've learned. If they have to go out for second opinion somewhere, they're readily available. They're not squirreled away in a pathologist's office.
Yeah, so one more question that we received online from Dr. Luquette. So he's asking if a portable scanner, microscanner, like a microvisioneer, would be an option for whole slide imaging.
A portable scanner, like a micro scan,
Yeah.
that's that particular brand?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, they do, so they do make, they make a hybrid device that will do whole slide imaging plus real-time video microscopy and just a video microscope. It is, yeah, it could certainly be used. It wouldn't be very high throughput. So depending on what you were going to use it for, and I believe that scanner holds 4 slides. So I don't think you couldn't put more than 4 at a time in there.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be particularly high throughput, but yes, you could use it.
Yeah. So this concludes the first day of the conference. This is the 48th edition of ET Bell Conference. Thank you very much. Good evening and good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.